our last word series right now. We're looking at the 7 sayings of Jesus on the cross. We're in week 3 of this, and we're going to be talking about a really unique story that I don't think gets a lot of discussion during this time of year, but I'm excited to dive into it with you. And for those of you who don't know, I am from a place called Moab. I am not a Moabite. If you're familiar with Genesis 19, you'll know that that's not a good thing. But I am from a place called Moab. Anybody ever been to Moab, Utah before? There's a few of you. Good. A lot of outdoorsy things, national parks, off-roading things. It's a great place. We're known for a lot of different things. What I don't see a lot of popularity around, though, in Moab are the raging flash floods, though. And Moab is pretty famous for its raging flash floods. It's a very dry place, but when it rains, like today, it can happen very, very quickly. And there's an actual bridge in the town of Moab that I think of with flash floods. There is an example that I have of a flash flood. And this is a Mill Creek, which is a tiny little creek similar to what maybe runs behind the church here. But when a flash flood happens in minutes, it can fill like this and be very, very dangerous in Moab. And I was thinking about what we're going to be talking about today, and I thought about this bridge right here that goes over this raging river. It's the bridge that kind of holds the main street over Moab, and if that bridge was ever to be destroyed by a flash flood or a raging flood, Moab would be cut in half, and you wouldn't be able to get to the other side of the city. And I was thinking about this as I was kind of contemplating our message today, and I thought about this sturdy, solid bridge that, the consequences of it being destroyed would be perilous for the city. But I thought about it because the bridge doesn't necessarily calm the waters as the raging waters flood through there and cause debris and all kinds of certain things that can be dangerous. The bridge doesn't calm the waters, but it provides a safe pathway over the raging waters so that we can get things and supplies from one side of the town to the other. And I was thinking about the idea of compassion with this image. The idea of compassion. And I think of compassion as like a sturdy bridge over a raging flash flood, as we see in my hometown. Compassion doesn't calm the strenuous circumstances that we're in. It doesn't stop the tumultuous floods from rushing into our lives. But it does seem to provide safety for people who are enduring hardships, pains and sufferings that can feel like raging flash floods. It gives people the support they need to move through struggle without being swept away in the circumstances. I want to talk about compassion today. As we look at the cross, as we look at the story of Easter, we see Jesus displaying compassion like this. In a world where life and circumstances around us can often feel like a raging flood, you guys ever feel like life sometimes is just continuously flooding and raging and it's tumultuous? You guys ever feel that way? We need compassion. And we need a Lord who displays compassion to us, who is like that sturdy bridge, providing a pathway over the raging waters, where maybe they're not calmed, they're not stopped, but we have access and a way of walking across it. If you have your Bibles, we're going to be in John chapter 19. We're going to look at verses 25 through 27. John chapter 19, 25 through 27. Let me read this for you. Near the cross of Jesus stood his mother's sister, Mary, the wife of Clopas, and Mary Magdalene. When Jesus saw his mother there and the disciple whom he loved standing nearby, he said to her, "Woman, here is your son." And to the disciple, "Here is your mother." From that time on, his disciple took her into his home. The disciple whom he loved there is the Apostle John. A fun way that he's writing in his gospel about himself in these times. And this is probably one of the darkest days in the gospel of John's kind of story up to this point. Jesus, again, was crucified as an innocent man, wrongly accused. And I think probably most tragic is most of his friends at this point had abandoned him. We know the famous Peter abandoning, where he denies Jesus 3 times. But out of the many hundreds that would have been his close disciples, including the 12, really it's down to this small group of people that now sit and watch Jesus be crucified. His mother, probably his aunt, Mary, the wife of Clopas, we know very little about, and then Mary Magdalene, of course, John. This small group of people, all that remains of what was a large following of Jesus at his cross. And I think what we see in this story in particular is the power of compassion and suffering. The power of compassion and suffering. One of my favorite writers, his name is Pastor Tim Keller, who passed away from cancer a few years ago. He wrote this line in a book called Walking with God Through Pain and Suffering. He says this: suffering can refine us rather than destroy us because God himself walks with us in the fire. It makes us far more compassionate. Makes us far more compassionate. And this is exactly what we see at the cross and in Jesus. As Jesus is hanging, suffering, dying, being mocked, all the things that beyond our even comprehension probably to understand, he looks at this small group of disciples, including his own mother, and he looks at them with compassion. This public spectacle amongst a group of people mocking him and insulting him, there sits a group of disciples that catch his eye, who were then coming close to him at the cross. He looks towards his grieving mother in particular, his friends and family with compassion as he suffers, as they suffer watching him experience this. And he has this compassionate response to them. You know, I don't think any parent should watch their child suffer as Jesus would have suffered on a cross. Yet Mary, his mother, must have been thinking about those things that were said to her when Jesus was just a child. Something that was even prophesied before. In Luke chapter 2, it says this, and Simeon blessed them and said to Mary, his mother, "This child is destined to cause the falling and rising of many in Israel, and to be a sign that will be spoken against, so that the thoughts of many hearts will be revealed, and a sword will pierce your own soul too." So these words that were given to Mary when Jesus was just a baby are being fulfilled before her very eyes. And I imagine that this blessing was in her mind and in her heart while she was experiencing the very pain of her soul being pierced at the watching of her son be crucified. A piercing of the soul is probably a pretty accurate description for what the events were happening around her. Something that the soul is that deepest part of yourself really being destroyed. The soul in the Hebrew mindset was this life force that really contained who you were. And Simeon's saying that very idea, very context of who you are is going to be pierced. And this pain, as he looks at his mother and his closest friends and disciples, he meets his mother in that pain. I almost imagine this in my mind as I think about this story. I think of these two eyes kind of locking each other as Jesus is hanging and looking down upon his mother, who's probably somewhere in the first two rows here, as they kind of have this moment of locking eyes together, and his heart goes deep in compassion for her. And he cares more about ensuring that she's taken care of and that she is not alone than he cares about the suffering that he is going through in that moment. Making sure his mama isn't alone and destitute comes to the mind of our God. This teaches us that God's love and compassion persist even in our darkest moments. That God's love and compassion persist even in the darkest moments. And I tell you, as you walk through this, as many of you have seen this in personal experience, this is the darkest moments is where you feel the least love and compassion from God, at least in the initial steps. As we're going to look at next week, a lot of times it feels like you're mostly abandoned by God than you maybe feel his love and compassion. But here you see in Mary's probably darkest day of her life, watching her son experience what he's experiencing, she is also given a love and compassion. That's even as the waters rage against us, that the Lord's eyes are on us with love and compassion. And this is so important, I think, in the idea of what it means to follow Jesus. Because when you follow Jesus, it doesn't mean you just follow him up the mountaintops. I wish that was what it was. But we follow him in the deepest valleys. And the most important thing as we walk with this out in our valley seasons is that God sees us with love and compassion in those valleys, as he does with his own mother and his friends. He gives us insight into how our pain can actually refine us into a more loving and compassionate people. That our response to this story really is a place where we then respond with love and compassion in our lives to all those around us, even in our darkest of moments. When it comes to the idea of pain and suffering, there's a line by C.S. Lewis. He wrote a book called The Problem of Pain. And I like what he says here. He says, God whispers to us in our pleasures, speaks in our conscience, but shouts in our pains. It is his megaphone to rouse a deaf world. This has been my experience. This has been my experience walking with the Lord, is that I have seen him and known him far greater and deeper in some of the darkest moments of my life, rather than the greatest successes. You know, and as a pastor who's walked with people for over a decade now, I've stopped giving the rational, comprehensible box answer for pain and suffering. You know, I've stopped trying to rationalize it with most people. I can give an answer if you're looking for one, but I really don't like going that direction all the time. I don't think pain and suffering fits our box very well. I don't think there is a good way to box, here you go, this is why God does this. Here you go, take it home with you. The thing where I sit now is this is truly just a tragedy of sin that we will all experience, too incomprehensible and complex to give a simple answer for. I can tell you, though, from personal experience, that while pain will shake our foundations, and it absolutely will, tragedy will shake our foundations, something all of us are going to go through eventually as we get older. It does leave room for Jesus to meet us in our stories. And then I think that is one of the most beautiful things about what our God does, is that he meets us in our stories of pain and suffering. It's in this place where Jesus demonstrates his compassion the strongest, where we're kind of woken up to the idea of, boy, we really do live outside of Eden. It's this constant reminder of, boy, we really do live outside of paradise, like we looked at last week. And it forces us to kind of reckon a little bit with, where do I meet God outside of Eden? How do I meet God outside of this place that we were created to be in perfect relationship without the consequence of sin and death at our doorstep? It calls us into a place where we are called to focus on him, not on the raging waters, the flashing floods that fill our creeks and it seems dangerous and perilous, but to really focus on that pathway, that sturdy bridge that meets us with love and compassion that we can then cross these raging rivers. That sturdy compassion of Jesus as he looked at his mother and his disciples, and his heart went, I don't want my mother to be alone. I don't want her to be destitute. I don't want her to experience those things. Here, John, take my mother. She is your mother. John, this is your mother. Mother, your son. There's a concept of family being united here, of not being alone and desolate. Our Lord showing compassion to his mother, I think, is a perfect illustration of how God affectionately looks at us and our pain as we look to him. And this is one of the hardest things to do, because pain can also grow a very calloused, hard heart. Whereas the compassion and love that we see really breaks through some of that and realizes that we have someone that we can trust and be close to. Again, we can't always rationalize the pain. I've stopped trying to rationalize it many times, especially through experiences in my life that I've shared with all of you before. But we can recognize that Jesus' compassion will find us and that he will meet us. Like Jesus locking eyes with his mother at the cross. It's this idea of God viewing us and seeing us in our deepest and hardest moments and showing compassion and love, saying, you are not alone. You will not be left destitute. And this is so meaningful to us because, especially in our darkest moments, I think the temptation is to really feel alone and isolated. In fact, there's a part of us that may even want that. I want to just not be around anybody ever. And it's meeting Jesus' compassion as he provides and cares for us that will refine us into a people who reciprocate with compassion into the lives of others. And this is exactly what happens. If you walk with Christians long enough, especially the ones that have been through really deep, dark valleys, They are some of the most compassionate and humble people you will ever meet. I grew up with people like this. I was so blessed to be able to be part of a church family as a kid that had people who had gone through extremely dark valleys and had come out the other side and had refined them into compassionate, humble, and loving people, because it tends to burn away some of that superficial stuff that we get caught up in. Like when things like with Thora May going through cancer, when it comes to tragedy, things like this, it kind of just burns away all those little things, those kind of ridiculous things that we fight over, those kind of stupid things that we argue about, doesn't it? And it brings us into a place where we're going, boy, what's really important is being refined by how we show compassion and love to one another in the hardest of moments. Because here's a little surprise. We're not always going to get things right, are we? As people, we're not always going to get things right. We're a community full of people, which means we're going to be extremely messy sometimes, aren't we? But I do hope that in our mess and pain, all of us are met with compassion, just as Jesus is showing his disciples in this moment. Because Jesus' compassion for his mother and his good friend made sure she wasn't alone. Made sure she wasn't alone, that she was going to be cared for. And as far as church tradition goes, we know that John cared for her the rest of her life. Because the Lord creates new family, as he does in this story. The Lord creates a new family. As Jesus' compassion looked to his mother, he made sure she had someone to care for her. We know Mary had other sons and daughters. Besides Jesus, we read about those. Yet Jesus gives her to John, his fellow disciple. None of Jesus' brothers and sisters believed in Jesus as the Messiah at this point, and they won't until after the resurrection. In fact, that's probably one of the greatest proofs of who Jesus was. If you can convince your brother that you're the Messiah, that's a pretty good convincing argument to me, especially when it's James. Jesus gives his mother a new family, a deeper family, not to the rejection of her current family. It's not that she just rejects James and all of the brothers and sisters of Jesus. No, but a family that transcends our biological families, a new family that transcends our biological families. There's a story where Jesus is teaching his disciples, and Mary, his mother, is out the door, and his sisters and brothers are with her. And the disciples that are in the room saying, hey, your mom and your sisters and brothers are here. Do you want to talk to them? And Jesus takes this opportunity not to respond to his biological family outside the door, but teaches disciples a little something about what it means to be family within the following of Jesus. He says in Matthew 12, 48 through 50, he says, who is my mother and who are my brothers? Pointing to his disciples, he said, here are my mother and my brothers. For whoever does the will of my Father in heaven is my brother and sister and mother. I always wondered how Mary took that outside the door. But what Jesus is teaching here is there is a deeper bond to those who are following Jesus that transcends our biological origins. As many of you know, family can be one of the greatest blessings in this world, but it can also bring some of the greatest pains and divisions in our lives. Maybe a little bit of both, depending on your story. But here is some good news. That as we follow Jesus, we are given a new family. Not necessarily to the rejection of our biological family, but to the expansion of a new family centered around Jesus. A commonality, a unifying force, even though we are radically different in our upbringing and our cultures. That I can walk into a church in the middle of Uganda and have a commonality with these people, even though we're just completely different. For some, following Jesus will come with it a price to be paid as far as losing family. In Utah, this happened all the time. I can remember young kids, especially teenagers, being kicked out of their house because they were part of the more predominant faith in Utah. And we would have to go pick them up on their front yards and give them a place to stay. This was a very common thing where they had to make this choice. Imagine being 16, 17 years old and making that choice. Do I go along with what my parents have taught me, or do I really want to follow Jesus? And it will cost that. The idea of adopting people into the family of God is a motif that we see all throughout Scripture. And that term for siblings that we see in the New Testament in particular will become the favorite word of the New Testament writers for the communities and followers of Jesus. But that term for the sibling that we're going to look at in just a moment is by far the most favorite word of the New Testament writers for what we are doing right now, which is church. It's the term adelphoi. The term adelphoi. And it's Paul's for sure favorite word for the community of believers. And I think this is so important if we're going to think about church correctly. I think there's so often we get so confused with what church truly is. But if we think about it as in the terms of adelphoi, in the sense of community of believers, which have this unity and family relationship and kinship to this central idea of who Jesus is, it changes how we function as a church and how we function with one another. This is what I think we're seeing being established here in this story as Jesus is looking to his mother and his disciple John, creating this family bond even though they don't have the same family of origin. You have Mary, who was a disciple of Jesus, her son, being entrusted and cared for by another disciple of Jesus, John. It's this tender-hearted, compassionate, affectionate moment where he's looking at his buddy John and says, dude, take care of my mom. Mom, this is your new son. Take care of him. Jesus establishes a bond that transcends all biological ties, creating a spiritual family rooted in faith and love. And this is the idea that explodes out in the New Testament in Acts and how the believers start to interact and treat one another as their own. This is so important if we're going to live out our faith practically in this world. And something that I don't know if historically the Big C church has done very well with this. I think we see a really good example in Acts, and then we kind of start seeing the church move away from this idea of kinship. We might say it to one another. This was my brother. This is my sister. But when it comes to words can be very empty at times, can it? But when it comes to functionality, this is where we see the gold. I think when it's done poorly, church really becomes more this institutionalized place where the institution of the church matters more than the people of the church. I think this is the tragedy that happens within churches. I think this leads to squashed people rather than support and care, compassion and love. When we love the institution more than we love the people. When it's done well, the church is recognized by the people that make up its community, all those faces that make up the people of God. A people who are valued and compelled to love one another despite all their differences. That is where the real refinement happens. Because God's love is displayed in them with love and compassion in the highest of mountains and in the lowest of valleys. And just like Jesus making sure his mother and friend had a mother and a son to care for each other, we are called to do the same thing today. We are to reciprocate this and mirror this and represent this back into our own communities. One of the ways that I see adelphoi, or this idea of kinship within the church, really actually saving lives is especially right now, I think the largest urgency is just within that global loneliness epidemic that we're experiencing. That's the greatest urgency and tragedy that I see right now, right? There was a survey done just last year. There are 52 million people just in the United States alone that experience loneliness every single day. 52 million individuals every day. While our world is often more connected through technology, we find ourselves now more desperate than ever for family and community. Any of you guys feel this? I feel this. I may have access to so many connections technologically, but I sometimes feel so alone and isolated when it comes from family and community. And I'm sure if I feel that way at times, I know you do too. Odds are, again, there are many people in this room who experience this every day. In fact, the way of the world teaches us that if we just pursue power, wealth, and reputation, we'll have everything we need. But what we're finding out now, that power, wealth, and reputation actually leave us far lonelier than we've ever been. It's literally killing us. These things have been tied to a lot of diseases, a lot of sicknesses. It will kill us physically and it'll kill us spiritually. And there's something to God saying, we need this kinship bond of family and community, the care for one another that is literally going to save people's lives. Jesus looked at his mother and friend with compassion, told his disciple to be with her, to look after her, to bring her into his household, into his home, to care for her as his own mother. And I think many a times we should look at one another in the same way today. And this is exceptionally hard and exceptionally inconvenient to our daily lives, but extremely powerful to the place where it can literally save someone's life to have this type of relationship. In Jesus, people can be rejected, ostracized, treated like an outcast. Man, this world does that. But if you look around in this room, there are mothers and fathers, brothers and sisters who don't care about your origin or your tradition or your ethnicity, but because of the commonality of being disciples of Jesus, that we all belong to one another. I think that's good news. That in this room there are mothers and fathers and brothers and sisters who want to be close to you. You have people who want to be close to you that God has provided to be a family. You don't have to struggle in loneliness and isolation. I think that's the biggest key phrase there. You don't have to struggle in loneliness and isolation. Russell Moore, he wrote a book called The Storm-Tossed Family, How the Cross Reshapes the Family. He says this: the church is not just a collection of individuals. It's a body, a family knit together by the Spirit. In a world of disconnection, it's where the lonely find a home. This is what I want church to be. This is my vision and desire for every church to be, is not a collection of individuals, but a unified body as Jesus is the head of that body, a family knit together by the power of the Spirit, a commonality of following Jesus, pursuing Jesus, resisting the urge of disconnection and division, which is so deeply rooted in our culture and our world, so that no one else ever finds the loneliness that you experience outside of this, but that everyone can experience what it means to be brought into a home. Is it a big task? It is. I know this, and it's a challenge for all of us, but it's a necessity. As we reflect Jesus even in this story, as he looks at his mother and disciples, and he makes those words and claims those things. Jesus' compassion is seen as he provides community even for the darkest of moments. In the darkest of moments of these people's lives, he's saying, just care for one another. Be as family to one another. That we never forget how deep we're called to be in relationship with God and each other. This is kind of the fun thing about this passage is the last couple passages seem to be much more a vertical relationship with God. And in this statement, he seems to be looking out more horizontal towards his disciples and say, you have to have each other's backs. You have to be along with each other. Be there for one another as kin, as siblings, as adelphoi, taking care of one another. So here's the application for today. First off, if you're struggling with loneliness, if this is hitting a chord, it is really important that you reach out. Because I don't know about you, I can't read minds. I don't know if somebody's experiencing loneliness or not. It's really important that if you're in those places that you reach out. Put it on a connection card. Put it on a connection card. You don't even have to say it out loud. Just write it down and say, I'm lonely. I want someone to talk to. Maybe you're shy or whatever it is. Just do it in a subtle way that recognizes, hey, I just want to talk. I just want to be involved with somebody. You don't have to struggle with this alone. And if that's not you, I want you to think and be praying about somebody this week who you can call or you can text or you can invite out to maybe coffee or lunch or dinner or have somebody over. Just be praying about who's that person that comes to mind. You're like, boy, I really haven't seen this person for a while. I haven't thought about this person for a while. Or how can I just extend an invitation to this person to say, hey, how are you? As we would do with our own families. Families don't all think the same, do they? Families don't always all get along the same, do they? It's going to happen, but there's still a common bond there, right? For most of us, it's a biological or traditional connection, but we need to see a little bit through that and transcend that into this idea of this is somebody who loves and follows Jesus. Why are we not reaching out to them too and connecting with them? So reach out to somebody this week. Be praying about who that is or who those people are, and let them know, even if you're just saying, hey, I'm just thinking about you. Just, you're on my heart, you're on my mind. This is one of my favorite things to do. It's just to let people know that I was just walking with Jesus, or I was on my bike, which I do a lot of now because my car's broken. And I just think, God, who do you want me to reach out to? Who do you want me to just to let them know how grateful I am and how much I love them and how much you love them? And that's a really fun thing to do, is to reach out that way and just let somebody know about that. So can you guys do that this week? Can you guys really, as we ponder and reflect on what it means to be family, as we think about this story, especially going into Easter and the resurrection, be thinking about those who are on the outside. Be thinking of those who are maybe not the same, and reach out to them.